Figure it out.
Hello, this is Adam Koralik from Figured Out Productions. The following video is a video of some kind, and I hope you enjoy it. Hey everyone, welcome to the FigureItOutcast. I'm your host, Adam Koralik. As always, I'm here to talk about a whole host of different subjects and to welcome you to the show. Thank you very much for being here. Now, this is a Patreon-backed podcast, so Patreon backers get it the day it's recorded, and then regular access is granted at the end of the month, usually on the channel. So thank you very much to everybody. If you are a Patreon backer, I appreciate it. You also get early access to videos and all that sort of stuff. And if you're just listening just to listen, I appreciate that as well. So what we're going to do is go over a bunch of different subjects here. I've put them all in the description as usual, so if there's any you're interested in more so than others, you feel free to skip around. But yeah, we'll just go ahead and get on with it. So the first thing we're going to talk about is very brief because I've done multiple videos addressing this now, but the Dreamcast just turned 20 years old, which is awesome. It's still kind of mind-blowing to me that we're actually at that point because, man, like, I remember it coming out so vividly. It's just one of these like really significant moments in my life as a gamer, and so to have it be 20 years old is just like one of those wow, I'm old moments. But this birthday is a little bit cool because usually when it comes to the birthdays, there's very few people who are like going out and acknowledging it, but this one's been kind of special because even Sega themselves is doing things to celebrate it because, you know, it's 20 years. That's kind of a big deal. So very cool. But I did a video on it. You know, I talked about all the stuff that they've been doing for the last year or so, like all the new games that came out and everything. So if you're curious, you can check that out. But just one more time, because at this point, the Dreamcast will have already been 20 years old. So one time, happy belated 20th birthday, Dreamcast, and we'll see you next year. So next subject here. Interesting little thing here. So for the first time in a long time, apparently Xbox was trending on Twitter in Japan. Now, the funny reason for this is that so Banjo-Kazooie is going to be DLC for Smash Bros. So he's going to be, playable characters. Now, Banjo-Kazooie originally got their start on Nintendo 64, so they always kind of felt at home there. But Microsoft has owned the rights to those characters for quite some time now. And while they did allow them to appear in things like Sonic and Sega All-Stars Racing and stuff like that for the Xbox 360, they haven't really done much with them outside of re-releases of the original games, which is kind of where this comes into play. The creator of Smash Brothers is the reason that the game started trending, because he wanted to, boost people's knowledge of the characters, particularly in Japan, where the characters are, it seems, all but forgotten because they just don't care about the Xbox iterations of any of that stuff. So he actually encouraged people to go out and get an Xbox One and get Rare Replay and pick up the re-releases of Banjo-Kazooie 1 and 2, and I guess debatably the third one, Nuts and Bolts, which was, the first time that Xbox had been trending in Japan in quite some time. Now, how much did it actually help them with sales? Who knows? But it's just kind of one of those things. It's just funny, like having, I've been there multiple times, and people have this assumption that Xbox basically doesn't exist there, and that's not really true. But the Xbox One in general is just, it's basically a ghost. Like, you have to really go out of your way to know where to find it. Xbox 360 though was actually pretty successful there. Xbox original not so much, but it did have a lot of worthwhile content. But it's just kind of an interesting story more than anything else. So I guess I hope more people get to experience the Banjo-Kazooie games, and hey man, if that gets people more excited about Smash and then they can play with those characters and get the most out of them, that's great. And this wasn't exactly what I was going to talk about, but since we're on the topic of Smash, it's also pretty cool that SNK got in there and allowed Terry Bogard from Fatal Fury and King of Fighters and all that stuff to now be a playable character as well. I think that's pretty neat. I don't know if those characters still get amiibos, and I don't really do much with amiibos, but I have to admit, the few amiibos I ever picked up, I always got more of the third-party characters than the first-party Nintendo characters. I don't know why. I just kind of thought it was neat that some of those characters were getting figures. Like, when else were you going to get like a Bayonetta figure, So if those two characters get figures, I might actually pick those up. We'll see. But, who knows? But yeah, that was kind of it. Next subject. Yakuza. The third through fifth game. I sat on this for a while, and they finally made it public at Gamescom. the third, fourth, and fifth game are all being remastered for PS4, which we've known for a while, but that they're getting a Western release is really the news. Digitally speaking, you can get Yakuza 3 remastered or enhanced, whatever you want to think of it as, now, but they are coming out with a Yakuza 3 through 5 set that's all physical, which is pretty cool. And one of the things that's in there that's strange but cool nonetheless is that the Yakuza 3 set, there will be actually like a physical PS3 case in there, or I'm sorry, Yakuza 5 will have a PS3 case as an option. And the reason for that was that if you ever decided to collect them all for the PS3, they were all on there except for Yakuza 5, at least physically, because that one we did eventually get, but digital only. So this will be the first time we get a physical edition of it. Now in Japan they got all of these, but to have them over here now is cool. They apparently also went in and did translations again, because I guess the original team, what they did with the translations wasn't quite as accurate or as good. I mean, that makes sense. Back then those games were, they barely made it out here at all. I mean, that was kind of, you put the D team on those just to get them done. But now Yakuza is kind of a successful franchise for Sega, so they're going back in and making sure it's done right. There's also a lot of content that was in the Japanese versions that was never brought here. They're bringing that out. However, I do know that there's one section of, I don't know which Yakuza game it is, but there is one section of it that has to do something with like, I think it's bisexual characters, and they're going to do something with cutting that or altering that. I don't know the details of it, but I do remember reading a little bit about it. But beyond that, it's going to be like the way, I guess, to play Yakuza. It should be like the definitive set. And I think the collector's set that only has, that has all 3 games is only like $60. So I'm definitely going to pick that up. So yeah, I just want to say that I think that's a cool piece of news. And speaking of collector's set, our next subject here, at the time I record this, Limited Run Games just announced publicly what their Shenmue 3 set is going to be. There is a Shenmue 3 Collector's Edition that's been pretty universal around various countries throughout Europe and I believe Australia as well. That comes with all sorts of little goodies. But I remember when I was talking to Limited Run Games, a couple of the guys from there back at E3, they were talking about trying to get some sort of special Dreamcast item in there. But they weren't really sure what they'd be able to do or what they'd be able to get away with. And then finally today they announced it, so it's public now. What they're going to do is they're going to include, very similar to Yakuza with a fake PS5 or PS3 set for Yakuza 5. Shenmue 3 is going to come with, the limited edition is going to come with a Dreamcast case, both Japanese and American. I believe it's reversible, that will present you with the artwork of what it would have looked like had the game actually come out on the Dreamcast, as far as the case and artwork goes. I mean, not like graphically or anything like that, but of course it's just purely ceremonial. There's no Dreamcast version or anything like that, but it's still, I think that's a neat little thing to have for sure. So I'm definitely gonna get a copy of that, as that'll be great, especially, I mean, I would have done it anyway, but like that version in particular I think would be really, really cool to have. So I'm looking forward to having that. And next up on our subject list here, this one is kind of rumor mill, because this story came out basically from one YouTube channel and it is kind of taken off a bit. But how accurate it necessarily is, we don't know yet. By the time the majority of you hear this, this might already be commonplace knowledge. I don't know. At the time I'm recording it, treat this as rumor mill. But the story goes that GameStop apparently has 4,400 U.S. locations, or at least locations. Maybe that includes worldwide. I'm not sure. GameStop does exist in a few other countries, but not too many. Supposedly, if the story is true, of the 4,400 locations, they intend to shut down 2,400 of them and leave themselves with about 2,000 locations left. Mostly in the more successful locations, generally in the higher, more densely populated areas. So a lot of the rural GameStops will get shut down. And the reason for this is obvious. It's GameStop is circling the drain. It's been common knowledge for a while. I mean, they fired off large amounts of their staff, including like management staff. And no, they tried to get bought and they tried to sell the company and nobody would buy it. That and they're not, I've never made a secret of my feelings towards GameStop. I think that they're not what they used to be, as far as being a cool place for people to go and talk about video games and, be social about it and buy video games. It became too much product pushing, and just became an overall annoying experience every time I ever had to go into a GameStop. It was just, irritating as hell. I mean, even as recently as earlier this year when, like, for example, I walked into a GameStop. I was in Guam at the time. I went into a GameStop and I was just kind of looking around because there's not too many video game choices in Guam. But I went in there and a dude just came up to me and he just started asking me for my account information, which is already kind of, like annoying. But then, I did it anyway, and he's just like, "Oh, cool, dude, you have a coupon for your birthday," because my birthday had been just like a month earlier. And I was like, "Oh, cool. What does that mean?" He's like, "It means you get, something like 10% off of, every game or whatever that you buy used." And so I was like, "Wait a minute." So, and I was like, "You got to buy 2 get 1 free deal here," or something like that. I'm like, "Is that all stackable? Like, can I come to you with 10 games and get 10% off each game, and then like every third game or whatever is free?" And he's like, "Yeah, totally." And I was like, "Okay." So then I spent a good amount of time in the store getting that stuff together, found the games I wanted, went up to the counter, and then he only took 10% off of one of the games. And I was like, "You said they would be all of them." He's like, "Yeah, no." So eventually we worked that out, but it was just like every time I ever went into a GameStop, it was just an awful experience. It was always just full of like lies or just ignorance, or it just irritating. Like I have so many bad memories of being in that store. So many times where I'd, pre-order something and, maybe because it would have like that pre-order bonus, and then the pre-order bonus would never show up and they wouldn't have them or they wouldn't care. And it was just like, great. I don't think I'm going to really miss GameStop when they're gone. I think there'll be that slight nostalgic vibe at some point. Not to the extent of like, say, Blockbuster, but I just can't. I mean, I'll miss them in the sense that they are a perpetuator of physical media, but they do it in a way I don't support. It's like technically in that sense they're on my side, but I don't really think of them as on my side about that because I consider their tactics to be wrong and just bad. So it's no surprise to me that they will be out of business relatively soon. At the rate they're going, like I made a joke when I was at Missouri Game Con and I had a panel and people were asking me if I had pre-ordered Shenmue 3 from GameStop, because GameStop's going to have this like exclusive little Dragon Phoenix Mirror coin that comes with the game. And people asked me like, had I pre-ordered it yet? And I said no. And then they asked why. I said because I'm not entirely certain that GameStop will be around in November for them to honor that pre-order, because that's the other thing. Any pre-orders you have that are outstanding by the time they file Chapter 11, they do not have to honor anymore. And your money's just gone. So, in this case, I finally decided, okay, I think they'll survive until November. Now, hilariously, I pre-ordered it, and then literally the next day, this news broke. So we'll see. But yeah, I guess we'll find out how true this is. But it wouldn't surprise me if at this point next year, GameStop doesn't exist anymore. Maybe I'd give them another 6 months from now, 6 months, maybe 9 months. It depends. Because when they shut down the stores, they will do a little better because there's a lot less expenditure and all that kind of stuff. But at the same time, like no chain ever shuts down like half their stores and then ends up coming out of it. That doesn't happen. Like a lot of stores have tried that over the years and it doesn't work. It's a very short-term measure just to kind of get stock prices up. And then make some sort of desperate attempt to get some money out of it for individuals, not for the company to survive and not for shareholders in general, just, very specific shareholders. So, yeah, I guess get ready because I'm sure at some point, probably in maybe spring of 2020, I would guess that GameStop's going to start doing fire sales and they're going to go out of business and they're going to just, everything's going to be like liquidated. I would just wait for that time if I were you. If you're curious, I think that'll be a good time to finally go to GameStop, get the Toys R Us like memory, except unlike Toys R Us, which was awesome. GameStop, I don't really have any great memories of you. But that said, there you go. So moving on. The next story, well, this isn't actually a story. Next up is a round of shout outs. Now everyone here is a Patreon backer. And I request that if you can support me on the Patreon to, again, get early access to this or early access to the videos, or just to support the channel, because I could really use it. But if you want, you can also, in addition to that, you can get shout outs. You can come up with subjects for this podcast. You can even be on it if you really want to. But that said, here we go. Shout outs. Corey Marsh, Jesse Perez, Joseph Tamburino, Luis Bonilla, Michael Kelly, Eric Perales, and Trey Wagner. Once again, Corey Marsh, Jesse Perez, Joseph Tamburino, Luis Bonilla, Michael Kelly, Eric Perales, and Trey Wagner. All of them supported me at the appropriate level in which they get a shout out. So I'm super appreciative of that, and also appreciative of every other Patreon backer that's on there. And just if you're even just watching this on YouTube regularly, I appreciate that too. So thank you very much. Our next story is the one that I know a lot of people were asking me about. Spider-Man was plucked from the MCU. Now, I've been talking about this happening really since like the beginning of my podcast. Like, I think when Venom first came out, or at least was announced, is when I started talking about this. Is that I didn't trust that Sony Pictures was going to continue the deal with Disney. Now, let me give you a very elevator pitch brief history of what happened here. While Marvel/Disney is the ultimate owner of Spider-Man, the character, and all the all the other characters attached to it, they do not own the movie option rights. Those were sold off to Canon Films at one point, and they changed hands a whole bunch of times until they ultimately ended up in Columbia Pictures, aka Sony. So Sony has had the Spider-Man character rights just for the purposes of film for a long time. And as much as Disney would love to get them back, they've been unable to do so because Sony has not been willing to do a straight buyout. And Sony at one point wanted to renegotiate the deal with Disney, and they did, to an extent that it allowed Sony some, I think it was like all the proceeds of whatever their films gross, but in exchange they had to give up the toy rights. That deal was cut, I want to say like in around 2010, 2011, something like that. Because originally the way it would work is if a new movie came out under a Marvel license that wasn't actually Marvel, the parent company, there was some sort of revenue share in which the movie proceeds would be split by some percentage, and then toy proceeds associated with it would be split by some percentage. So Disney got full toy rights back because up until then they were being very hesitant about what they would put Spider-Man in, just because they didn't really make that much off the character. And then Sony was so confident in their Spider-Man movies that they thought, okay, this will work out better for us. Ultimately, what happened was that the first Amazing Spider-Man movie came out, the reboot, after Sony screwed up Spider-Man 3, which was all corporate interference from them, which is, a sad story. But they decided to reboot the whole thing. We got the Amazing Spider-Man 1 and 2. Amazing Spider-Man 1 did okay. Amazing Spider-Man 2 did not. And they ultimately fired Andrew Garfield over a situation in which he didn't show up to an event. And Sony ultimately was forced to cut a deal with Disney because they risked having to either reboot the series again, only a couple years after they had just rebooted it, or lose the rights to the character. That's the other thing, is they have to have a movie in production every couple of years, otherwise they lose the rights entirely. So they cut a deal with Disney. And the deal basically stated that Marvel would reinvent the Spider-Man character for the purposes of movies and ingratiate him into the MCU. What ultimately came of that was Spider-Man's cameos in Captain America Civil War, Avengers Infinity War, Avengers Endgame, as well as Spider-Man Homecoming and Spider-Man Far From Home. But after that deal, it was done. I think all parties believed what was going to happen was that they were going to find a way to renegotiate the deal. Now, I've been saying this for a long time, that I never really trusted Sony on this, because if you read their 2014, North Korean hack emails, they make very clear what their objective was, which was to basically get Marvel to reinvent the brand for them and then take it back and then just kind of hijack it. Like, they were saying that pretty openly back then. So it's kind of amazing that Disney didn't. I don't know. I guess they thought that money would prevail, but whatever. So when they started making their own other properties, they made the Venom movie, which was basically the attempt to set up a side universe in the event that they couldn't reach a deal, they could say, hey, we have Spider-Man, and we put him back in there, and we connect him with Tom Hardy's Venom, and we just build our own thing that way. And you essentially trick the casual moviegoers, because you still have Tom Holland, because he's contractually required to do at least one more movie. And from what I've read, he sounds like he's going to keep playing the character even beyond that one movie. Which will be intentionally confusing, I think, for the audiences, because he'll just suddenly vanish from the MCU, because they're not allowed to reference him anymore. They're not allowed to say what happened to him. They might be able to say, what happened to that kid? I don't know, or something like that. We don't know. Whatever their lawyers all decide is okay. But essentially, you're going to now have this like side Venom verse, as it's commonly called, that's going to have Spider-Man in it, but he's not really the same Spider-Man that appeared in the other films. In fact, I think that there's some legalese reason for this, but any character that appeared in those films that was like a mutation of the Spider-Man characters, like, so I'll give you an example, like Aunt May. The traditional Aunt May, that was an older woman, did not appear in the Disney movies. And the reason wasn't because, we wanted to reinvent the character. I mean, that might have been part of it. But really, it's because a traditional one, if she appeared there, then you've put her into a split, contract situation. So once the deal's not agreed upon anymore, then the character is frozen. In other words, Disney couldn't be able to use the old Aunt May, and neither could Sony. So all the versions of characters you got in those movies were like off-brand versions, which is why Mary Jane Watson is not the traditional redheaded version. She's just called MJ. In fact, she has a completely different name. They're essentially all brand new characters that just try to make you think they're the older characters, but from a legal standpoint, they're different. The one exception being Spider-Man, because the whole deal was centrally located around him. So I think that almost all the supporting characters from all the Spider-Man movies, those two Spider-Man movies, will not appear in the new Spider-Man 3, whatever you want to call it. And you got to give Sony props. They love the proud tradition of always fucking up Spider-Man 3. The actual Spider-Man 3 sucked ass. Amazing Spider-Man 3 completely was canceled and botched, and now they've done this. It's just like, God damn it, you guys. So just be cautious. We warned you. There was a lot of channels warning you, like, don't support the Venom movie because it was going to lead to this. And the other thing that I think did a lot of damage to this whole thing was Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse. Now, that movie was perfectly fine. It was pretty looking. It was a good movie. It was fun. But I think that Sony's confidence in what they could do with the characters at that point is probably what led to this. From everything I've read about this, it was mostly Sony's decision to pull out of this, and the decision was likely made around the time they won the Oscar for that film. Essentially, you got to ask, like, well, why? Why would they do this if the deal was so successful? I mean, this news came off the back of the fact that Spider-Man Far From Home was the highest grossing film in Sony's history. Why would they suddenly want to kill that deal? Because they now believe they're at a place where they're so confident in their own brand that they don't feel they need Disney's involvement anymore. They don't need to do any sort of profit sharing anymore. They believe, foolishly, I think, that audiences will be tricked, essentially, into going into the next movie and thinking, oh, this is the same thing. This is all MCU. I don't know any different. And I just want you to be aware that this movie and the Spider-Man franchise is in the hands of the people who made Amazing Spider-Man 1 and 2, made Spider-Man 3, and the guy who screwed up the X-Men. Tom Rothman, who was the guy who, spearheaded the Wolverine movie, who was the guy who prevented Deadpool from getting made until he was gone. That's your A-team who's in charge of this Spider-Man franchise now. And this is essentially our comeuppance as a society for having supported the Venom movie, which I didn't. I saw it on a plane. I never went to go see it in theaters. But, man, that's depressing news. I'm not happy about this at all. I kept hoping that they would work this out. But, yeah, man, that sucks. And it's going to suck so much for the MCU as well, because they bet hard on keeping Spider-Man, because, like, they set him up as, like, Iron Man's replacement and all this stuff, and now he's just poof, gone. And that really sucks. So watch out for the MCU. I think they're going to start leaning more on the Fantastic Four and the X-Men, and it also explains why their Phase 4 stuff didn't include any Spider-Man references. And The situation is just so frustrating, man. But hey, it is what it is. If you want more information on all that stuff, and I know a lot of people bring it up, they're just like, well, how do you know Disney isn't the bad guy? Like, you know, I obviously wasn't in the room for any of this stuff, but it's in Disney's best interest to keep that deal going. Like I said, they set up their whole universe around wanting to keep the character. So I'm sure they were willing to cut a very sweet deal with Sony. So it's very odd that Sony did this. I mean, it makes more sense for Sony to do this because they believe they can go off and do this on their own. And they essentially used the MCU to reinvigorate their brand. Disney doesn't have a motivation to pull out here. That's all I'm saying. And if it was really about money, I think that they would have come to a deal on that one too, because again, Marvel bet hard on Spider-Man sticking around. I mean, this last movie ends on this big cliffhanger. You know, it's so frustrating. But whatever. So if you want more information on this stuff, I'd recommend you go to a YouTube channel called Midnight's Edge. They've done great videos breaking all this down. It's really good stuff. But next subject. Speaking of the MCU, there's a rumor going around right now, and I'm not buying it, which is that X-Men New Mutants might be the MCU launching pad for the X-Men. So this requires a little bit of a backstory. When Fox was still its own thing, Fox, very similar to Sony, had rights over certain Marvel characters, most infamously the Fantastic Four and the X-Men. Now that Disney has acquired Fox completely, they have those rights are reverted back to them. And while Fox was still doing its own thing, they had 2 X-Men movies in production. One was X-Men Dark Phoenix, which did eventually come out and bombed like crazy, and X-Men New Mutants, which was actually originally slated to come out into theaters like 2 years ago. It's been quite some time. And from what I've heard, basically the idea was that, you know, they weren't super confident in the movie and they wanted to do certain reshoots and all this stuff, and that kept causing delays. Then eventually the whole Disney-Fox merger came into play, and Disney basically requested that Fox not release these X-Men movies because it continues to taint the brand. They want to separate the X-Men brand from the Fox era as much as possible because then they can do it cleanly and not confuse audiences. So that's the goal. So they ultimately did release Dark Phoenix just kind of because it was a done movie and it was like, whatever, let's just recoup some of this and call it a day. But X-Men New Mutants really has no reason to exist. It's just intentionally confusing. And it's apparently not even that great of a film. So the story that's going around right now, and I repeat, this is just a story, I don't really believe this is the case, is because it hasn't seen the light of day and it's not released. Supposedly what Disney is trying to do with it is remove any references to the Fox era X-Men. So like, you know, any connection that it might have had, you know, different cameos or whatever the case might be, to remove those. And then possibly, if Kevin Feige thinks it can work, retool it as some sort of soft introduction to the X-Men into the MCU. And that way they can kind of hit 2 birds with 1 stone. But it's from the rumors there, it sounds like it would be his call. But that, to me, I don't really believe that. That doesn't sound like something they would just give up and they just, you know, make the chance. Just, hey, Kevin, do you think this will work? Sure. You know what I mean? Like, I feel like if this movie comes out, it might be some sort of Elseworld story that's exclusive to like Disney Plus or something. I feel like that might be the way to handle it, because everybody who really knows about this movie knows what the situation is. So I don't know if you necessarily want to muddy the waters of the MCU with this. You know, the movie's done. You're not making anything back on it. Like, you know, I don't know. I just feel like you should just do it and that way and just kind of cut your losses and move on. Because so far, the Disney-Fox merger has not worked out well for Disney. A lot of the Fox movies that have been coming out have been tanking like crazy. I mean, it'll get there. I mean, it's understandable. It was a big process, and obviously the reason they bought all this stuff, partially, you know, they're motivated by the X-Men and Fantastic Four coming back, but really it was more about having a giant catalog of content that they could throw up onto Disney Plus. But we'll get back to that in a little bit. But yeah, that's kind of the situation there. I'm not personally buying that this will be the first MCU movie for the X-Men. And there's another rumor out there right now about how Deadpool was possibly the only remnant of that might survive. And now people are talking about how they might have to just recast, which I really hope they don't, because he was so perfect in that. Unless you can make that the joke that they rebooted Deadpool and he once again, because that's the third time he would have been, Deadpool would have essentially been rebooted with the same actor. I mean, Deadpool is the one franchise I think where the character is so self-aware of how crazy it is that could actually work. But that would require some very creative writing. So we'll see what happens with that. But anyway, moving on. Speaking of various shows and properties and things like that, one that I kind of talked about this a while ago, but now it's actually official, is Obi-Wan Kenobi's getting a show with Ewan McGregor reprising the role as Obi-Wan Kenobi. See, when Solo came out, and even before that, like I remember a long time before that, I kept being like, why would you give Han Solo his own standalone movie? Like that's a character that definitely didn't need one. There's very few characters that I think are deserving of that. Obi-Wan Kenobi is an exception. Like he actually would have an interesting story, like, you know, after Revenge of the Sith but before A New Hope. Like the dude has the weight of the galaxy on the shoulder. It all came crumbling down debatably under his poor tutelage, you know what I mean? And he was unable to prevent it, while meanwhile having to, you know, monitor and take care of the kid who is the offspring of the person who did all this. You know what I mean? It's just like, it's a dramatic story. And I thought that would have made a good, you know, individual film. And I think at one point that probably was going to be the case. But then what screwed that up was the complete flop that was Solo. So now Disney's very standoffish about what they're going to put into theaters with the Star Wars name on it. But they still need Star Wars content. So that's going to come over to Disney Plus. They showed new footage of The Mandalorian as well, which I guess is going to partially explain the rise of the New Order and all that stuff. But then Obi-Wan is going to have its own thing, and it's going to be a mini series. It's not going to be like this ongoing show. I think they said something like 6 to 8 episodes, which I think is also the case with The Mandalorian, as well as a lot of those Marvel shows like WandaVision and all that stuff. So yeah, where that leads me into is Disney Plus itself. Now, Disney Plus, when the first time I ever heard about it, I really was like, whatever. I don't really care all that much about it, you know, because like most people, you go, I've got Netflix and I'm fine. But every one of these like digital competitors to Netflix that's been coming along has been kind of weak. Like Amazon's okay, Hulu's okay, but then you have certain companies that are like, we have our own thing, and you're just getting too many streaming services, and it gets kind of irritating. But most of them fall to the wayside because Netflix is just so associated with that concept. So Disney Plus seemed like another one of those. But Disney Plus, man, I got to admit, it's starting to look tempting. Like to have all of Disney's catalog behind it, as well as all of now Fox's catalog, all the Marvel stuff, all the Star Wars stuff, all the Pixar stuff. Like having all of that, in addition to all the new content they're producing for it, like they're doing it well. They're doing it correctly. Like that's going to be a streaming service to watch out for. And I sit here and I think like, do I really want to subscribe to another digital streaming service? I don't know. But as I was kind of, I had a little extra time in my hands, and I was like clicking around Netflix looking for some stuff to watch. And then there was a couple of shows that kept popping into my mind. And then I was like, oh, I'll watch that. Oh, no, that's not on here anymore. And I realized they've all been moved over to Disney Plus, or will be, mostly because there are a lot of like Fox content. So Netflix, man, they got to be worried because a lot of their stuff is getting pulled by a lot of other companies. Yeah, you know, so I'll keep an eye out. I think I might subscribe to Disney Plus at some point, which is, you know, kind of embracing my fears to an extent, because I'm not a huge fan of digital content, particularly with games. With movies, I don't have as much of an issue with it. But yeah, we're getting there, guys. We're getting to the point where everything's going digital. And one thing I fear is Disney Plus. What scares me about it is Disney is known for being very particular with how they release things. Like they always had that infamous The Vault thing. So like they would release a movie on, you know, VHS or Laserdisc or whatever it is, and then they'd put it back in the vault and not release it for a long time. But at least if there were old physical media copies around, people could see them in some form. But if they're successful with Disney Plus, they have complete autonomy and complete control over how they distribute their products, and also when they take them down. I mean, piracy aside, of course, it bothers me, because I also believe that if Disney Plus is successful enough, then they'll probably cut their Blu-ray support. Because as much as I love Blu-ray, it is an old format now. It's been around for 13 years, which is insane. And I don't know, Blu-ray or 4K Ultra HD Blu-ray has not really taken off. I mean, to be fair, original Blu-ray never really exploded, I think, the way that they thought it would. Not the way like DVD or VHS ever did. And it's still around, it's still good, but it kind of feels like it's just lingering. So what worries me is I think we're not too far away from a point where some big company announces they're just no longer doing physical media releases at all. I think we're getting there, and it's gonna suck. And then we'll start seeing places like where you have to like get a physical edition from like Australia or something, because Australia is known for actually having a lot of physical editions of things that other countries don't get. But we're going to get to that point for a while, and then you're going to get to that point where only like super collectors can have like the Criterion version, and I'm not looking forward to those days. And I think that Disney Plus might usher in I don't want to say the beginning of that, but like the next big domino to fall. And yet at the same time, here I sit thinking about supporting it. You know what I'm saying? Because they've been very good about what they're going to have on there. So yeah. All right. And our last subject up here is an oddly particular one. This was kind of requested from a few different people. So this is about traveling to Cuba, which really has nothing to do with pretty much anything I ever really talk about. But so for those who don't know, if they missed my episode of Playload, I went down to Cuba last month. Very briefly. A buddy of mine was just like, yo man, you want to go to Cuba? Like, I'm buying. And I was like, all right. So I had never been to Cuba before, and I thought, okay, this would be cool. And we just basically went to Cuba for a weekend, and we just hung out and explored Havana and stuff. And so when I casually mentioned that, and a lot of people were like, how the hell did you do that? Because Cuba still has the remnants of the Cold War embargo on it. The U.S. puts on there. So this advice is mostly for Americans who wish to see what Cuba is like. A lot of other countries do not have this problem, where they've been able to go to Cuba for a long time. But even if you go to Cuba in other countries, you still can run into some of these issues. So this subject comes up for anybody who is interested in the idea of going to Cuba, particularly as an American, and what was involved with that process. So I'm going to say this from the perspective of an American, but if I have any advice from people from other countries, I'll tell you as such. Now, because of the embargo technically still being there, there's certain oddities that arise. Now, I don't mean to get political here. This is just a fact. At the end of the Obama administration, one of the things they did was they lifted certain elements of the embargo, as much as a president can lift, because you require a congressional act to make that occur fully. So that meant things like Cuban cigars and stuff like that was now legal. You could bring stuff back from Cuba. Prior to that, you couldn't bring anything back from Cuba. You couldn't even legally go to Cuba. Now you can, unless before you needed certain exceptions. Technically, you need those exceptions, but they've made it way easier. So we're just entering the new phase now. We're not going to talk about it like as if it was late 2016. Now, what you can do is I flew on United Airlines, and United Airlines makes this relatively easy. Because you are an American, you cannot just show up in Cuba. You need a visa to enter the country. Now, you can get that visa through traditional means if you want, by, contacting an embassy and all that kind of stuff. However, they've really made this a lot easier. You can now buy the visa from United Airlines. So if you go to there's basically, when we flew from Houston down to Havana, and in Houston, Newark's the other airport that they fly out of as well. And in both cases, what happens is when you go to check in, there's a specific section just for people going to Cuba. And what you do is you go to that line, and they let you buy the visa right then and there. And the visa costs $75. You also have to pay a $25 health insurance fee, which is built into the cost of your plane ticket. What that means is when you arrive in Cuba, you're fully insured through the Cuban health care system. Not that I used that, but it's a fun fact. If you've done it all through legitimate means, you have full health coverage while you're down there. But anyway, so you pay $75 and you get this visa. And they also ask you a question, which is, why are you going there? There are basically like 12 acceptable answers. And tourism is not one of them. The irony of this is you're sitting there trying to buy a tourist visa. So it's all bullshit, but it's just something you have to play that game. So my answer was journalism, or it was supposed to be. The reason I say that is that's something I could prove. You know, I am a YouTuber. I can say I have a YouTube channel. I talk about video games, and I'm curious what the video game scene is like in Cuba. You know, that was the story I had planned. And my buddy was going to just piggyback on my story if, you know, it came up. He was just going to be like, yeah, you know, I'm his cameraman. He needs help. You know, like that was going to be the story. So funny, we were together and she just asked him like, okay, why are you going? And he goes, journalism. She goes, okay, great. That's it. Done. There's no follow-up question, nothing. She never even asked me because she saw we were together, so it's just fine. You just gave me one of the 12 acceptable answers. So when you read about that in advance and it says like, oh, I need all this information, you don't. You just have to know one of those. You said one of the 12 acceptable words I'm allowed to hear. Congratulations. You can have your visa now. So they give you the visa. And they make a very big deal about this because you have to fill out the visa 100% correctly. If you make any sort of typo or anything like that, it invalidates the visa. So be very careful when you fill it out. Don't fuck it up. So we just filled that out on the plane. No big deal. Make sure you keep the visa, though. You will need that when you exit the country. Like, don't be like, oh, I'm in Cuba. Now I can throw this away, because you will be stuck in customs if you don't have that. So keep it until they'll take it from you when you attempt to leave the country. The other thing to keep in mind is even though the United States is telling you, hey, you're going there as a journalist or whatever you said, you are buying, like I said, a tourist visa. So when you get to Cuba, you tell them you're there for tourism. You basically have to you have to tell two different stories. It's really kind of annoying. But when you fill out the Cuban entry papers and all that stuff, make sure you say that you're there for tourism and have nothing to do with journalism, because the Cubans may not let you in if you say journalism, and the Americans won't let you go if you say tourism. So just, you know, make sure you know who to lie to. And then that was pretty much it. Like after that, all we had to do was just go through security as one normally would. And yeah, we were ready to go. We got on the plane and we went. So when we landed, you basically just get off in Havana and you just walk down onto the airport on the ground, and you go into the airport terminal. And then you have to go through customs, which was really not a big deal. We just got there, stood in the line, waited. And then when we got up to the front, you just hand them your passport and your visa. And then they just do whatever they got to do. They take your photo and they stamp your visa, hand it back to you, and they stamp your passport, hand it back to you, and then that's it. You're back in Cuba. You're now in Cuba. Now, we were kind of surprised by how easy it all was. So then you go through different security lines, because they do check all luggage upon arrival. They check everything, kind of the way one would check through security on the way to an airport. They check you on the way out of the airport as well as to the airport. Just so you keep that in mind. I don't know what they're looking for. Obviously certain types of contraband, but nothing that we had, certainly. But anyway, so we then left, and we did this intelligently, I think, because in advance, we'd learned a few things. One, our phones would definitely not work down there. The Cuban internet infrastructure exists, but it's not good. And their own, individual mobile data plans are really just for them. So you don't really have access to it unless you're willing to pay ridiculous roaming fees. And I mean ridiculous, like 2 megabytes for $1. You know what I mean? Like it's insane. So it's not something to ever think about doing unless you just have way more money than you know what to do with. So we never did that. So in advance, we had reserved an Airbnb as opposed to a hotel, which I'm really glad we did, because our Airbnb was amazing. It had 2 beds, full kitchen. It was fantastic. It was weird because the outside of it looked kind of decrepit, but inside it was just like completely modern. It was fantastic. So air conditioned, all that stuff. It supposedly had free Wi-Fi, though. We only got that to work once for like a minute. And for that to work, you have to stand out on the balcony and like hold your phone into the air. I never got it to work. He got it to work once. But anyway, so you can't count on internet access down there. The other thing is particularly for Americans, your credit card will not work down there. Most places do not accept credit cards, and even if they did, American credit cards specifically are not accepted. Not because the Cubans don't like it, but because American credit card companies are still not allowed to work down there. So even though you'll see signs for MasterCard and Visa and all that stuff, that only applies to Canadians or people from Europe or what other parts of the world. American cards specifically will not function down there. So you have to have cash. And that's the other thing, is you have to have Cuban cash. So when you get there, there's two types of currencies, which is kind of confusing. There is CUC and CUP, which is two different. One is like 1/20th the value of the other. It's intentionally confusing. One is made to be, one's the traditional peso, which is worth a lot less, and then there's one that's basically meant to be an almost 1-to-1 with the US dollar. Most people prefer that currency, but you have to be careful because some people will trick you into saying, if something costs this much in the smaller currency, they try to get you to pay that same amount, but in the bigger currency. So if something costs 8 cents, they're like trying to get you to pay $8. You understand what I'm saying? Or they'll intentionally give you the wrong change. You just got to be careful. My buddy knew what was up, so he was on top of that. So we didn't have that problem. So keep in mind that ATM cards and all that kind of stuff is not going to work down there. So what you have to do is you have to bring enough cash with you and exchange it at the airport. And I hate airport currency exchanges, but that is your only choice. Because all the cash you have on you is all you're going to have for the entire trip. You don't really have access to other resources. You can't withdraw more money. You can't use your credit cards. You can't do, Western Union, any of that stuff. It's not an option. So you have to have the right amount of cash with you. And unfortunately, for Americans anyway, USD is not a great currency to bring down there. They'll take it, they'll convert it, but they don't pay you as well for it as they would for, say, euros or especially Canadian dollars. That's like, outside of Canada is like the only country where CAD is actually quite valuable because a lot of Canadian tourists go down there. So we did that. And also what we did was we had pre-ordered a pickup, an airport pickup from the Airbnb. So they would take us to the Airbnb and eventually they would take us back to the airport. Even though it was technically more money, it was totally worth it because the stress of trying to call a cab or any of that stuff when we were there would have been awful. So we were super appreciative that we had done that. So I can't recommend that enough. So once we got to the Airbnb, that was it. Like, you had free roam. It's not like you have to go do some special tour group or any of that type of stuff. We just hung out at the Airbnb and we would go out and just check out the city, walk around, and then find our way back. And that was it. We had a good time. Food can be a mixed bag there. There's a lot of really bad food. There's a lot of okay food. A lot of hole in the wall type of places. Try to find, something that's nice, that's air conditioned. Food is generally cheap. And one thing we learned was, no matter what you do, I don't care what the context is, if any place, any restaurant, store, anything like that has a promoter outside, someone being like, hey, come on in, come check out their store, never do that. Ever. Those stores, the reason they have someone doing that is they make enough money ripping people off that they can afford to have someone out there trying to rip people off. We ran into this problem multiple times where, like, a restaurant was like, hey, come inside, it's fantastic, it's all air conditioned, food's cheap, it's great. They blatantly ripped us off. We went inside, air conditioning wasn't on, didn't work. And the at the end, like, the bill was higher than it was supposed to be, and my buddy was like arguing that point with them. And then they eventually said, oh no, the extra, I'm not even joking, the extra $2 on our bill for this thing was because of a ketchup packet. The ketchup packet was expired, which was never even used, but they charged us without us requesting it. Like, stuff like that. It was just, never go to a place with a promoter. And the same went for other places with promoters, like stores. Like, we went into this tiny little strip mall type of store because they don't really have like big grocery stores or anything like that. No, certainly nothing chains like Walmart's, none of that type of thing, but just like some mom and pop, store with knickknacks and things. We just wanted to go in and check it out and see if there's anything we'd like. And some guys like, yeah, come inside, touristy stuff. And we're like, okay. And they literally charge you a fee for having a bag. Like, I had my backpack on me. They wouldn't let me take it in the store. They held on to it. And then they charged me a fee to get my own bag back. And I was like, the hell is this? So never go to a place that has a promoter. I can't stress that enough. Another thing to note is that a lot of people will come up and talk to you. We weren't really used to this because, honestly, people don't, at least in my experience, in the US, people don't really go up and just talk to people unless they want something. Possibly homeless people asking you for change, like that type of thing. In Cuba, a lot of people will just come up and start talking to you. Now maybe it's because we stand out like a sore thumb, like we're clearly not from there. I don't know. And this is both good and bad. People were always very friendly, and they'll give you a lot of local advice and stuff like that. But you also get a lot of people who are like clearly trying to talk to you, hoping you'll tip them for that conversation or because they showed you something, and you're just kind of like, to me that's awkward because it's like, dude, I didn't ask to come here, and you're like awkwardly making me go somewhere because it's socially awkward not to follow you, you know, like random stuff like that. That's just strange. But that, I found that to be very common there. Although crime is extremely low there because they have like security cameras on like every street corner, and so some guy kept telling us like, oh, you never have to worry about crime here because like if I did anything, it's like, oh, the cops are at my house in a minute because look, there's a camera there, there's a camera there, there's a camera there, which I don't want to get into the politics of that, but it's an interesting point. But yeah, that happened to us quite a few times where people would just pull us over and just start talking to us. Like in one thing we learned was, obviously it's very hot down there, and it's like one of those countries where you can't drink the water. We would do that occasionally, but only by like boiling it first, and even then you could still see like stuff in it. So it's best to get bottled water. And we learned that you shouldn't be walking around with bottled water because a lot of people will try and stop you and ask you for bottled water. So if you have a bag, put the water in the bag. And then beyond that, no, I had a good time, and I don't want to give the impression that I didn't, but I made a friend down there, a couple friends, one in particular, and I was talking to him a lot about video games down there. So I actually did fulfill that whole journalism thing. I was asking, like, what was it like? What's the question? You know, like, he's like, well, we have a lot more of the modern stuff, like PS4 and stuff you can get. We mostly game on PC down here, if you can get that. He's like, there are internet cafes still, which I did see, and they had lines out the door for those things, and it's usually just like one computer inside, and people would wait to play for a while. But he's like, he's like, in the 90s or so, like, most of the video game consoles we had were Russian clone consoles of the NES and the Super NES. So he said something interesting. Like, I knew that there were Russian clone component versions of the NES and the Famicom. Famiclones. We think of Famiclones now as like NOACs, like a single chip that does everything. But back then, the Russians would make a lot of over-the-counter equivalents. They would just grab parts that were very similar and just make you a Famicom. I knew about that, but he said they did the same thing with Super Famicom and Super Nintendo. And he's like, those are kind of cool. He's like, they're hard to find, but they look very similar to a Super Nintendo, and they're entirely Russian made. But he's like, yeah, he's like, I had one, blah, blah, blah. But he's like, gaming down there wasn't that big of a deal, and still kind of isn't because of internet infrastructure and all that stuff. But yeah, it was still a cool experience to have. And then when you go back to the airport, again, we had reserved a ride in advance, so we knew to do this. When you get there, customs is important. Make sure anything you bought in the country, there's a very specific rule about this, you have to put in your checked bag. You cannot bring it on the plane. I don't know why, but that's a thing. So be aware of that. And then what'll happen is you clear exit customs, and then you get on your flight. But if for some reason you're denied access to the flight, which we weren't, but if you were, you would actually be stuck there because you no longer have a valid visa to get back into the country. So just make sure you play by the rules, especially when it's time to leave. Yeah. Oh, and if you are desperate for internet access, you're probably wondering, like, what do you do? How does it work? It's not like impossible or anything. What they have is these like internet codes. They're called like ESTAs or ETSAs or something like that. Etsica, I think it is. Etsica. They're like little codes where you get 1 hour of internet access at a compatible area. So if you buy those little cards, which the guy who drove us there actually, he said, here, take a bunch of cards, and he just charged us like $5 for like 5 cards. And what you do is you go to like a park or the airport, for example. You go to one of these places that has the compatible Wi-Fi signal. You log into that, and then it'll be like, hey, give us the code. And you plug in your code that you've got, and you get 1 hour of pretty functional internet access. And that was good for just like, checking email and all that kind of stuff. But yeah, don't go down there with the expectation of that kind of stuff working. Going to Cuba can be a little intimidating because you're missing a lot of the modern conveniences. But that said, we did perfectly fine. We had a good time. And yeah, ultimately we just just had fun. So yeah, if that helps anybody out there where they're curious about how that works, there you go. No charter flights, direct major airlines. I believe United and Southwest go there. I think American Airlines did go there, but I think they stopped. But yeah, that's about it. So hopefully that helps somebody out there. Thank you very much, everybody, for listening. If you could like, comment, subscribe, I'd appreciate it. Once again, thank you to all the Patreon backers, particularly the shout-outs going to Corey Marsh, Jesse Perez, Joseph Tamburino, Luis Bonillo, Michael Kelly, Eric Perales, and Trey Wagner. Thank you all very much for listening as well, and I'll see you all later.